Good evening everyone and welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update tonight for the Australian region, the 11th of February 2014. My name's Chris Nitzo and we've got a few things to cover tonight. While it might look like it's all quiet on a cyclone front, and it is in terms of the next, say, 5 to 7 days, however, the period after day 7 gets very interesting across Australia. Now, we're also looking at some fairly decent rainfall over inland parts of Queensland, which is going to be a very welcome relief for a lot of graziers and farmers. At this stage, there's pretty high confidence. I won't say it's going to happen, but there is pretty high confidence based on a number of different model guidances that we're going to see an increase in rainfall over inland parts of Queensland. And also, we're going to talk MJOs and also where the tropical cyclone threats could lie over the next 2 weeks. So, let's get into it tonight. Alright, the monsoon trough still raging away. This is the tropical low we were last watching going to head possibly off the coastline to the east of Port Hedland, but it didn't eventuate. It stayed inland, and that's what about 50-50 the models were in terms of whether it was going to get offshore or stay onshore. Regardless, though, it's causing a lot of rainfall in the Kimberley, Pilbara, and also the interior parts of WA, and you can see here it's a very well-structured system. Out to the further to the east, we have ex-tropical cyclone Fletcher, which continues to be a well-structured tropical or monsoonal low as it pushes in a southwest direction. Now, once again, these two can't get away from each other. They love each other that much that they're going to perform a bit of an interaction again as they head southwards into the northern parts of South Australia. This one will head to the south and then southeast or east, and this one will head in a more southerly direction. This one will possibly wash out. We're not quite sure yet whether it will wash out or whether it'll interact and this becomes the most dominant feature. So they've been having a bit of a byplay here between themselves for almost a week, possibly a bit longer than a week now, these two systems, and they're not done with just yet. As we head further to the east, though, in the Queensland region, devoid of much weather at all, there are a lot of thunderstorm activity, some isolated to scattered thunderstorm activity developing here over the southwest, but whether you're going to get much rain out of that, it is really hit and miss. So the welcome signs are, though, that we're going to see much more general activity over the northwest and the central west parts of Queensland. We'll talk a bit more about rainfall shortly. We saw some excellent rain over the Queensland. It's been a couple of days, so we'll just backtrack to yesterday morning, rainfall to 9 a.m. yesterday morning. We saw some really good rainfall over the Queensland coast, even getting into the interior districts of Queensland in the central interior. And we also saw the northwestern parts, for instance, Cloncurry receiving around the 40mm mark. Mount Isa also receiving some pretty good rainfall. Throughout the Flinders Highway basically copped a fair bit of rainfall anywhere west of about Richmond. So there's some really good signs there, and there could be some really good signs of some follow-up happening as well. Now, the Gulf country was very wet at the time. We had ex-cyclone Fletcher pushing in a west-southwest direction. We also had the Kimberley region of WA very active as well, as the tropical low was threatening to get off the coast. Fast forwarding to 9 a.m. this morning, we saw that rainfall extend southwards with the low. Because the low didn't push offshore, we didn't get all that rainfall in the coastal sections. Most of it has pushed more inland, and we saw some really good falls, 50 to 100mm in parts of the East Pilbara. And also the Kimberley, the heavy rain along the Kimberley continues, with parts of places around Derby receiving over 100mm. The region in the Gulf country remains very active, 150 to 200mm there, in fact, in parts of the southern Gulf, and also the eastern parts of the Northern Territory receiving some pretty decent rainfall as well, with that tropical low moving in a westerly direction. Through Queensland, things dried out considerably on the coast, but we did see some more rainfall inland in some shower and storm activity, although not as widespread this morning. The MJO remains pretty weak, and it remains in the Western Pacific, so we still have the possibility here. Oh, sorry, not the Western Pacific. It's sort of just remaining in the quasi-stationary region around the maritime continent, and it's very weak at the moment. However, I'm going to show you some of the model projections that show the MJO will kick on again very much like it did in January, or should kick on again very much like it did in January, and that will mean a heightened risk for tropical lows, tropical cyclones, and enhanced rainfall across northern Australia over the next 2 to 3 weeks. So using the Euro ensemble, we see that on the 10th of February was when this model was plotted. We see that the MJO remains very weak, just like I showed you on the bomb picture, and it will remain weak for the next 3 or 4 days. So we're going to see a weakening, I guess, of our monsoon slightly. Now, be aware that we have two very, very strong tropical lows over the inland parts of the Australian region. So regardless of what the MJO does, things are still going to fire to some extent. Now, what's going to happen next week, though, is we're going to see the MJO kick on again in the Western Pacific and Coral Sea region. Now, that doesn't mean the activity will be limited to the Coral Sea and Western Pacific. It means that the entire Australian region will see enhanced rainfall and possibly enhanced chances of cyclone development in and around that time, as well as the parts around Fiji, particularly the western parts of Fiji. We'll see that heightened risk as well. Now, that MJO continues to be reasonably strong, or not reasonably strong, but at least continues to be a feature throughout the 2-week period as it heads into Phase 7. The UK Met ensemble continues to agree with the European, except the UK Met slightly develops the MJO into a much stronger pulse as it heads into the Western Pacific. So if the UK Met comes off, we could see enhanced chances, even greater chances of enhanced weather across Australia than the European is suggesting. The NSEP guidance from America using the GEFS particular model, we're looking at an enhanced period, but more so for the further east. So looking at being in Phase 8 or Phase 1, more so Phase 8 in the Western Pacific. And so therefore the GEFS model keeps a lot of the rainfall and enhanced cyclone development potential out towards Fiji instead of in the Coral Sea and over Australia. So we see a significant difference there in the model guidance between the Euro, the UK, which are both suggesting Australia and the Coral Sea region will be active, compared to the GEFS, which suggests that Australia may not be as active and the activity will remain in the Western Pacific more than the Australian longitudes. The Japanese forecast cuts basically in between both the UK/EC versus the GEFS. The JMA, which is the Japanese model, it has the Phase 7 and early Phase 8. We have the MJO accelerating towards those phases and also amplifying in those phases as well. So it sort of keeps the activity a little bit more to the eastern half of Australia and through to Fiji. Whereas once again the UK and the EC keep the activity firmly over Australia and the Coral Sea. So folks, regardless of which model you decide to take on board, there seems to be a situation where we will see an increase in activity around the Australian area. Now, where in Australia at this point in time, models differ, but that's okay. That's expected to happen this far out. So for this week, we're looking at fairly quiet conditions, despite the fact that we've got those two tropical lows. We're not looking at any new tropical lower cyclone development, at least for this week and into this weekend. However, it's next week that we're starting to get a little bit excited about. So if we take a quick look now over the next few days at what we're looking at happening with these two tropical lows. So this morning we saw the tropical low ex Fletcher here, and we saw the WA low in the East Pilbara district. Now if we head forward to tomorrow morning, we see that the tropical low over the East Pilbara moves southwards. Ex Fletcher almost washes out into really a broader surface-based feature. So, and we're probably starting to see the start of that in the satellite image I showed you at the start. So I guess we could see that this model really is starting to show possibly what is actually happening in the atmosphere, whereas in the past a lot of the model guidance has been struggling with ex Fletcher, whereas we're starting to think that this may be a more likely scenario now where ex Fletcher tomorrow really starts to wash out. So as we head to Thursday morning, we see the WA low continues to push in a south to southeast direction across eastern parts of Western Australia, and is starting to broaden out into a much weaker but broader feature, almost like a trough system as such. Then as we head towards Friday, it almost becomes just one big broad area of low pressure across South Australia into New South Wales and southwestern parts of Queensland. And And it briefly pushes eastwards overall. This area of low pressure pushes eastwards across to New South Wales, even gets as far. We see some fairly strong winds in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere across southern Queensland as well. But we also see a remnant low staying put over the central parts of Australia. And what we also start to see is a high pressure ridge builds in underneath behind all this, and we'll start to push this low in a northwesterly direction back towards northern parts of WA. So as we start to head towards Sunday, you can see that we've basically broken off this complex area of low pressure into that one that's stuck around the central parts of Australia. It is now starting to push in a northwesterly direction in response to this big high building in underneath. And that high is going to try and push it in that direction there, northwest. Sorry, that arrow is supposed to look like a northwesterly arrow. We'll just try that again. So it's trying to push it in that direction there, and eventually what will happen is that ridge will build right underneath it, and once the system pushes northwest, it will then start to push in a more westerly direction. So let's have a look at how that goes over time through to the 7 to 8 day period. So there's our low on Monday, pushing in a northwesterly direction. And we have a nice big high pressure ridge building in through Western Australia and starting to push into the Bight as well. So on the northeastern periphery of that ridge, we should continue to see the system tracking in a northwesterly direction. Now, around about Monday to Tuesday, we actually start to see a monsoonal flow increase across the northern half of Australia, particularly around the Northern Territory. So you can see this yellow shading on this map here, in this area here, showing some fairly strong winds. Now, those strong winds are coming in from the northwest, so that's a new monsoonal burst coming over the top of Australia at around about the same time as this tropical low is making its way back towards the northwest, back towards the Kimberley coastline. Then as we head towards Wednesday, that monsoonal burst also meets with the tropical low, pushing in by that stage a more westerly direction. So you can see right now what's happened is that the high is now pushing in directly underneath the system, and in the mid-levels especially, we're seeing that high south of the actual tropical low or tropical cyclone, and therefore it will stop pushing in a northwesterly direction and push more in a westerly direction by that stage. So by the midweek to late week next week, we'll see it pushing more in a westerly direction, and the idea is that it should, and I always say should, not will, should push off the Kimberley coastline, and then we'll have a reasonable chance at reforming into a tropical cyclone. Or sorry, not reforming, but forming into a tropical cyclone later next week. Now, in our last update, we said that this area here we were looking at for that potential, and we still are. And we're still looking at that same time frame. Thursday to probably Saturday next week is when we're looking at this area particularly being favourable for the development of something significant. Now, as we head into that Thursday period next week, so Wednesday to Saturday, I said is the key time in this particular region. We see the first in the ensembles. We're looking at the Euro ensemble here. We've obviously got that tropical low pushing in a westerly direction, but interestingly, we also now have a new area of interest in the southern Gulf of Carpentaria that could evolve, and we also have this broadening area of low pressure across the Coral Sea. And so these two areas will need to be watched in terms of further potential. Now, we're not getting a very clear signal out here as to what will eventuate, but what we can say is that even though it's not a clear signal and it's not a strong signal, we are getting some type of signal from both the guidance from the Euro and also from the CMC model, which is suggesting that this area will start, or the low pressure in this area will start to deepen and possibly centralize around an area. Now, it's interesting and important to note that the steering pattern at the time is likely to be westerly for all of these systems. So whether or not these systems form is under dispute at the moment. We're not sure. But if they do form, we are looking at a situation where the general steering flow of the atmosphere at the time is expected to, by all ensembles, is expected to be east to west at that particular moment in time, at least over the far northern reaches of the Coral Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and the Kimberley coastline. So all of that looks like it's going to be heading westwards at that particular moment in time. We have a fairly benign or fairly stable pattern in the upper levels developing across Australia. I guess once again the only element of doubt would be the Coral Sea and whether or not there might be a little sharpish upper trough pushing in there from the Tasman Sea, whether it's pushing northwards at the time. But at this point in time, folks, anything that forms out here is likely to push in a westerly direction. So that entire region needs to be watched because, as I say, while we're not getting as strong a signal as the Kimberley low or cyclone, we are getting an increasing signal here for something to deepen, either in the Coral Sea or the Gulf, or possibly even both areas, the Coral Sea and the Gulf. So can I just re-stress the time frame we're talking here is a long way ahead into the future, and we're talking around about the Wednesday to next Saturday. So next Wednesday to next Saturday, by the time we start to see these things at least starting to happen. We're not saying that anything that does happen will hit the coast by then, but what we're saying is that we should be seeing the start of these systems, of whichever ones form, around that Wednesday to Saturday period next week. So if we start talking about how that equates to rainfall across Australia, now we always know that an MJO in phases 5, 6, 7 and 8, or even phase 4 and sometimes phase 8, but 5, 6, 7 at least, is always going to be beneficial for rainfall across Australia, and that's really what we're starting to see here as the MJO strengthens. Now these are the first 4 days, so the MJO has very little effect on Australia right now because it's very weak. So right now we're watching a tropical low pushing south and then southeast across WA. We're watching X Fletcher pushing southwest and then probably completely weakening out across the Northern Territory. Now we're seeing that these two systems, once again, this one weakens out, this one pushes eastwards, and then eventually a bit of a complex interaction between a new ridge pushing in underneath will push the system back to the northwest. So we're going to see some really good rainfall in the meantime while the system tracks in a south to southeast direction. Now over the next 4 days after that, the pattern of rainfall becomes quite complex because we actually see that tropical low wash out into a fairly broad system, and so we're going to start to see some fairly scattered showers and storm activity across Queensland, across New South Wales, getting into the inland regions as well. So we're going to see fairly widespread falls of 10 plus millimetres and even fairly widespread falls of 25 millimetres over the north and over the central and southern inland parts of Queensland. Probably the southwest misses out on the bulk of the rainfall, but we also start to see an increase in rainfall again over the Northern Territory, pushing back into the northwestern parts through to the Kimberley as that tropical low pushes back to the northwest. So it's going to be a complex pattern for rainfall at least over the next week. So this is our weekly rainfall totals expected by the global computer models combined. We see that, once again, most of the rain over the inland parts of Queensland doesn't fall on days 1 to 4, it falls on days 5 to 8. And we see that most of the rainfall here along the East Pilbara and interior of WA falls in the first 4 days. Yet this rainfall that we're seeing through central and central parts of Northern Territory and the Kimberley falls fairly evenly on all 8 of those days. So once again, folks, it's the complex movement of that tropical low currently over WA that we really need to watch, because it does have the potential to bring significant falls of rain across whatever parts of the country it actually goes through. So let's take a look at that complex pattern in a little bit more detail using a number of different global models. Thanks to WeatherZone for these global models. For access to them, go to weatherzone.com.au and sign up, and you'll have access to all these global models that I'm showing you right now. So 24 hours Access G shows very heavy rainfall across WA. We expect that. As we head to 48 hours, we see that rainfall continues to push in a southeast direction. We see some moderate rainfall through the Northern Territory. We see X Fletcher has completely washed out on this global guidance. As we head to 72 hours on the Friday, we continue to see the rainfall pushing southeast with the system. As we head to 96 hours, we see that a fairly complex low develops around across New South Wales and South Australia, bringing in a lot of tropical moisture into the interior parts of Australia. As we head to day 5, we continue to see that low over the southern parts of Queensland. However, we have some fairly dry air over the state in Queensland, so not much of that is forming into some decent rainfall. But by Monday, we start to see an upper level trough and an associated moisture feeding in from the tropical parts of Australia and from the redeveloping monsoon. And we start to see some light to moderate falls of rain across inland parts of Queensland, and those falls of rain continue through to Tuesday and actually get a little bit heavier, and even into Wednesday they continue over the inland parts of Queensland. But we also see that by Wednesday, remember that's our time frame, we're starting to see that low developing over the Kimberley, and we're watching the Coral Sea and the Gulf of Carpentaria for potential development. By Thursday, the Access G model develops a Gulf low, develops a Kimberley low as well, and then by Friday we continue to see those two being features. We also see an enhanced area of rainfall across the Queensland coast. So we're going out a long way, folks, but there are positive signs there for particularly the farmers and graziers in Queensland to see some pretty decent rain. Maybe not so much in the first 5 or 6 days, but after that through to about day 9 and 10, there does look to be some reasonable potential there for. So if we take a look at the GFS precip charts for this week, we don't see too much happening over inland Queensland this week, and that's pretty well standard with what we're seeing on most of the guidance. We still see some very heavy rainfall over NT and WA, and then as we head to next week though, and next week we do start to see some more reasonable falls of rain getting into the 30 plus millimetre range in parts of Queensland. Now remember, of course, that the GFS model and its ensemble are suggesting that the MJO is going to be a lot more centred in the West Pacific than it is going to be in the Australian region. So there is still the possibility that this particular global model may be underestimating the rainfall potential across northern Australia into next week based on that guidance of where the MJO will lie. So if we go through this animation now and have a look at what the GFS model is predicting in terms of rainfall, and you'll see the timestamp on the top left of your screen, and you'll see the rainfall amounts. This is using the ensemble guidance, so it's likely to be a lot more accurate than an individual run of the GFS that I just showed you. And if we continue to track the rainfall here, this is now out to 3 days, and we continue to track it as it heads further to the east, and we see that little complex low developing around southern South Australia and into New South Wales, and we start to see more and more rainfall starting to spread eastwards across the interior parts of New South Wales and Queensland. And I guess this is the key time for our farmers and graziers in Queensland who are all drought declared, or very much of them, very many of them are drought declared. The Sunday, Monday, and then into Tuesday, Wednesday period, we're going to see just enhanced rainfall there from that troughing associated with that complex low pressure system or low pressure trough that has a fair bit of tropical moisture coming through. And so we see that by day 10, we continue to have just generally at least some agreement that there's going to be some rainfall remaining. At least it might be a bit more isolated though at that point in time as we head to next Friday. Once we get that far ahead, the ensemble guidance starts to go a little silly and puts rainfall where it shouldn't and that sort of thing. But look, folks, there are some positive signs there. I don't know if it's going to be drought breaking. I don't think it will be, but at least that's rain, and there is some sign that there might be some follow-up to it in the 3 to 4 week period as well. So that can only be a positive thing. Alright folks, thanks for watching tonight. Look, there is no cyclone threat to Australia at least until mid to late next week, we would think. So therefore our next update will be on Friday. Our next update after that will likely be on Tuesday, and then we'll probably go back to nightly ones after that, because by that stage things should start to fire up again next week. Alright folks, so thanks for watching tonight, and we'll talk again on Friday and see how all of this is progressing. Good night.